I'm Gary Marcus. I'm a cognitive scientist and entrepreneur. Lately, I've been doing a lot of AI policy. You might have seen me speak to the US Senate in front of Sam Altman. It is my great pleasure to be here today with Karl Friston. I will let him introduce himself, but I will say that in my former life as a psychologist and neuroscientist, that people worshipped Karl for more than one reason, and it's exciting to be here with him today.
That's very gracious of you. Thank you very much. My name's Karl Friston. I am a cognitive scientist, psychiatrist or part physicist, but not an entrepreneur. So I don't like to sit with an entrepreneur.
But now you're actually helping a company. Maybe we'll get there. So, I mean, in some ways we have similar paths. I think we've both been interested in how the mind works fundamentally. And for both of us, that has brought us to some degree into this artificial intelligence world. What I would like to see is a new form of AI that was based more on causality. And maybe we can talk a little bit about the stuff that you're up to, where I think you are thinking a bit more about causality. The mainstream AI right now is not really about causality at all. You can sometimes get it to say something like A causes B because a bunch of humans have used those words. That doesn't mean the system actually understands. The system will get confused and say that 2 kilograms of feather weigh less than 1 kilogram of steel. Like, it doesn't really know what these words mean. It doesn't really know what causality means. We're going to need a new breed of AI. I think you have some ideas about that. We probably need more ideas than the whole planet has collectively right now. Eventually, we'll have enough paradigms that we'll have an AI that can act more like a scientist than we have now. That's when I think it might be really helpful to neuroscience. When it can invent new ideas, which is not really in the scope of what we got now, you're approximating the data. You're not learning what actually causes those things. Is that your take?
Yeah, no, you've used all my favorite words there. You've talked about understanding, causal reasoning. All of these things depend upon belief structures. And of course, if you haven't got a belief structure inherent in your AI architecture, you can't do any of these things. To understand is to have that mechanistic, causal ability to reason through, I would say infer, just because that's the way you manipulate belief structures.
So belief and uncertainty, I think, are super important. I don't think the current AI systems actually have beliefs. They are able to confuse naive users into thinking that they do so. Because humans are gullible and most aren't trained to think about cognitive psychology or causality or behavior in its relation to underlying mechanism. But I think you and I know they don't have beliefs.
Why is it that we are so easily seduced into attributing, say, large language models with the kind of reasoning, the kind of understanding that you and I enjoy? Even to the extent of talking about hallucinations. I mean, that's a very gracious attribute to a transformer.
Yes. Side note, I'm responsible for that. I kind of popularized that term. And on the plus side, it became the word of the year in 2023.
I didn't know that.
But it's not a very good term, right? Because hallucination still implies a level of belief, and it's a kind of personification. We need a term for it just made that up. And the word that has stuck is hallucination. But you, as a psychiatrist, know what actual hallucinations are. It's not really the right term.
But it is a seductive term.
It's stuck. It's stuck. I did it in a few interviews and it's spread.
But it's also a very gratuitous word because, just to address the second point of your question about, starting from very different positions, how did we end up in a very similar place? So hallucinations, of course, is one of the paradigmatic features of psychosis. So, in my day job as a neuropsychiatrist, much of the motivation for the theoretical accounts of human brain function was motivated by, well, where do hallucinations come from? And can you understand that in the context of how a brain works, well, indeed how any sort of sentient self-organizing system works? And of course, at the end of the day, what is an hallucination? It is a false inference. It's either inferring something is there when it's not there. There's a whole other raft of really quite crippling psychopathologies that are the reverse false inference type 2 errors. So inferring something is not there, it is. Those, I think, are pure examples of false inference. So what that tells you is that if you want to understand psychiatry and certain aspects of neurology from a clinical perspective, then you need to understand the role of inference in the brain. And of course, inference is just making moves in terms of information processing that resolve uncertainty, making your beliefs more precise, or in some instances realizing you didn't believe something, convictions were not quite as justified as such. So we come back to exactly where we started, which is understanding is all about belief updating, using or everything that you have available to you in an active way to get the right kind of data, content, sensory information, either from the outside Wikipedia or indeed from your own body, that resolves your uncertainty about the way that you work in your lived world.
We don't really understand how the brain does inference in general, especially like if you think about logical reasoning and so forth. We know that the brain doesn't do it that well. So people sometimes ask me to compare humans and AI. My argument is we're not actually trying to imitate humans, because there are a lot of problems in the inferencing that humans do. My favorite example of this is confirmation bias. So we try to infer how the world is working, but we mostly pay attention to the evidence that supports our own beliefs. We tend to be dismissive of the evidence that doesn't. And that has terrible political consequences, right? That leads to polarization. People can't find any compromise. So there are some horrible flaws in human reasoning. And yet there's some stuff that actually works pretty well on a day-to-day basis. Like, we don't routinely walk in front of cars. Like, we pretty well get around the world most of the time. People will tell me, yeah, well, you say that the computer has an hallucination, but you know, people do too. And I'm like, yeah, but if you look at driving statistics, people have an accident or a fatal accident like once every 100 million miles. Like, they're not hallucinating other cars in front of them and slamming on the brakes routinely. So they have to, on the one hand, there are ways in which human inferencing actually works pretty well, like in routine, just navigating through the world. Then you have like these political things where confirmation bias is terrible. And so like we want an AI system that's as flexible about inferencing as people, but without these flaws. Like a lot of it, I think the flaws are really about ego. Like I think confirmation bias partly comes because we can't search our memories like a database can, and partly because I guess the other one, what did they call it? Motivated reasoning. Like, we really want to be right. We don't want to acknowledge the other because it's not good for our ego to acknowledge the wrong. So we have less like noise in the channel. But even with the noise in the channel, it's still better than any AI system that's out there in terms of like really being able to deal with the open-ended world and inferencing. And I look at all this and I'm like, humans are a low bar. It's got to be possible to do better than this low bar. But then I'm frustrated, like, that the AI is not better than the low bar. Like, I really want to see it better. And I'm also frustrated that neuroscience doesn't really, like, I wish I could, like, look at a brain and say, these are the beliefs that this person has. Or, like, would it be great to have, you know, virtual assistants that talk directly to the brain and could, you know, be a step ahead of me? But we're not really there yet.
I often think that machine learning has just got the wrong words in the title. This is not about learning, it's about inference. And let me ask you, do you think machine learning has got the right maths, the right ideology, the right calculus, the right tools to address inference properly? It does learn beautifully, but can it do inference?
I think that, in fact, it does a subset of learning beautifully. But, I mean, we know from cognitive psychology that there are actually many forms of learning. There's observational learning and there's conditioning and so forth. And machine learning is doing kind of statistical correlation learning fabulously well over huge data sets, and that turns out to be much more useful than I think anybody reasonably could have imagined. But there are other things involved in learning that are more like logical inferences, like the kind of learning that you do when you learn physics or economics or something like that, where you're really learning new ideas. And I don't think that the current generation of AI is equipped to do that, to really learn abstractions and to be able to compose those abstractions into greater abstractions, which I think is the greatest pinnacle of human thought. Like, I don't think it's there yet. People sometimes talk about, like, is AI where a dog is? I think we're not even where a dog is, because a dog can actually...
A bumblebee or...
Bumblebees are actually pretty cool. I don't know if you know the comparative literature there, but they can do certain kinds of interesting imitation learning. They can do certain kinds of interesting navigation. Their dance has a lot of innate structure.
Yeah, communication.
Guys, that was great. I just want to don't forget this last question. Right now, the entire AI industry is largely focused really on what's described as AGI, so human-like intelligence.
You know what's funny about that is a couple of years ago, I wrote this critique in 2018, deep learning critical appraisal. And I said, neural networks as we know them now are not going to get us to AGI. And everybody got mad at me and they're like, nobody's talking about AGI. That's not what we're doing. We're just doing machine learning. And now 5 years later, everybody's got AGI in their title and they're all pretending. It's
And even,
so funny.
even now, Sam Altman and others have leaned into sort of super intelligence, the idea that the recursive agent is going to then become more intelligent than all humans. I'm wondering, just what you guys think about the idea of concomitant, how neuroscience and the work around neuroscience and the sort of vision that you have about what is super intelligence.
I'm still trying to come to terms with what AGI means. I'd love to hear the two define it. There's so many definitions, particularly the open AI definition doesn't seem to. I thought AGI was just basically the generalization of artifacts towards a more bimemetic natural intelligence. So it becomes generalized, exactly in the way that you were talking about in terms of humans can cross the road quite adequately and drive cars.
Causal reasoning. And
If you look at the history of the field, the people that coined the term, I think, were Ben Goertzel and Shane Legg. And what they talked about was basically having a machine that was as broadly as flexible as a human mind, could do sort of arbitrary problems, had generalizability, and so forth. So actually, a curious side note is on my Substack, I bet Elon Musk I offered Elon Musk $100,000. He's that AGI would not come by 2029. He said AGI was imminent, and that was the criteria I used there. And I checked in with Goertzel and Legg and said, "Do I have it right?" They basically said, "Yeah, that's what we were talking about when we coined the term. Is the broad generality, flexibility of human thought." But there is a second definition that OpenAI uses, and I think it actually comes from Koshla, but I'm not sure. And it's to describe it in terms of being able to do most human economic work or something like that. Labor replacement. I think that's a very different definition to think about in terms of labor replacement. That's very subjective. I mean, they're both subjective in different ways, but one of them is really about cognitive capabilities, and we're cognitive psychologists. We can recognize them. The other one interacts with what jobs are people doing, and that to me doesn't really seem like a measure of AGI. That's more like a measure of when are we going to replace everybody. I mean, that's more about employment and implication for society. Obviously, there's a relation between the two, but I really don't think they're the same, and I would not call the work definition AGI. And hopefully what we actually do is we augment jobs and don't replace any jobs. We just make people do things that are more fun and more cool. And so nobody gets replaced, but really AGI in the sense that I think of it make everybody individually super empowered to do amazing things, and maybe we'd all still have jobs that are super cool.
Karl, I think that we have a very different idea about what that term means. Superintelligence, not a sort of single agent that then self-recursively, grows to beyond human intelligence. And I just thought it'd be I'd like to hear what Gary thinks about the vision that you put forth that we're wanting to back.
We didn't. I would use the confirmation bias just to sort of as a move into that area. So when you're confirming who you're confirming with, so you're immediately in the game of sort of sharing knowledge, belief sharing, which speaks to a move possibly outside the realms of cognitive neuroscience into social neuroscience. So I think that from my point of view, in terms of understanding how neuronal populations self-organize in the right kind of way, if you find the right principles, they should also apply as to how populations of people, theologians, ideologies, also communicate in the right kind of way. And of course, that now provides a frame to think about, well, what is confirmation bias? Is it just talking to your friends to make sure that you're on the right track?
I mean, confirmation bias can happen within a single individual, right? And then it can happen at a society-wide scale. So the simple individual case is I just kind of convince myself that I'm right about something, and I don't even ask anybody else. And then there's echo chamber effects where we talk to our friends who agree with things. I think Sam had this phrase that I've kind of made fun of a few times, which is AGI is going to be wild. He did it right after DALL-E came out, and I was kind of annoyed because it felt like an advertising ploy to say, we've reached it with DALL-E, and I think DALL-E had anything to do with AGI. But super intelligence in the sense that you just talked about really will be wild. When we have are AI systems actually contributing ideas as opposed to just kind of mimicking some phrases, like genuinely creating ideas and maybe interacting with us, being sounding boards for ideas? People do that a little bit with GPT-4, but in the kind of not very reliable kind of way,
Right.
half-baked kind of way.
Brainstorming a bit, yeah.
Brainstorming a bit, but the responsibility is still very much on the human to make sure. But when we have AIs that really are like contributors, like right now they're almost like consumers of ideas, but they don't really produce new ideas. But when they do,
emergentism, that then it's interesting to use the word wild, because of course what people like me often of course do is biomimetic self-organization of a natural kind, which of course is one way of reading what you mean by wild.
yeah, I mean, we might, like the whole ways in which we workshop and develop ideas as a society will change when there are agents really genuinely contributing. Like, I don't know any real idea that has come out of GPT-4.
Right.
Unlike, many newspaper columnists that I read that like genuinely interesting ideas are reflecting, talking. And so, but eventually that'll be common.
Right.
And like that will change the transmission of ideas and how we, there's a kind of marketplace of ideas, and it will utterly disrupt that. And that's,
And so
wild and the crazy
From that point of view, it's less about interpolation that we see sort of LLMs and Gen AI doing, but truly, genuinely new creative things that then make us smarter. So superintelligence is more like a superorganism of humans and agents.
I think we should
across networks of intelligence.
Once we work out the safety issues, which we didn't talk about today,
Yeah.
which keep me up at night and which are terrifying.
Yes.
Once we make real progress on the safety issues,
Yes.
I think superintelligence could be a great thing. It could take us beyond the mediocre level of tribalism where we're stuck right now
Yeah.
in society. And I think there's great potential there. I do think I'm not in a rush to have superintelligence, because I think right now we're way over our skis. We don't really know how to make any of these things reliable, controllable, truthful, safe, etc. But if we can get to an AI that can tick those boxes that should be minimum, then we could have like an intellectual playmate that could be amazing.